The little girl was cleaning car windows to save her mom. Then a lonely CEO learned why and changed everything. The morning air in Manhattan was bitter, biting through coats and scarves, as if winter had something to prove. Traffic groaned through the streets, horns blaring, lights flashing, people rushing to beat the clock. Brian Blake sat behind the wheel of his black Mercedes, engine humming, mind far from the chaos around him. The light turned red. He exhaled slowly, staring at the gray skyline. His thoughts drifted to the hospital where, just weeks earlier, his father had taken his final breath. His mother had died when he was 8. Now, at 35, Brian was completely alone. His penthouse was quiet. His billion-dollar tech empire impressive, but hollow. He had everything, except anyone. A soft tapping on the window pulled him from his trance. He turned and saw a small hand pressed against the glass. A little girl, no older than 5, stood on tiptoes, peering up at him. Her blonde hair stuck out from beneath a worn, knit hat. Her cheeks were red with cold, her coat oversized and faded. Dirt smudged her face, but her eyes, wide, bright, held something rare. Hope. She held up a frayed cloth, offering a timid smile. "Hi, mister," she said, her voice muffled through the window but sweet and steady. "Can I clean your window for $5? I'm saving up to help my mom in the hospital." Brian blinked. He rolled the window down a few inches. "What did you say?" $5. I clean really well. My mommy's sick. She's in the hospital and I want to help." Brian looked at her, stunned. A 5-year-old offering to wash windows, alone, in the cold? This could not be real. "You're out here by yourself?" She nodded. "I stay near the hospital. I know which cars are nice." Before he could say more, she stepped up and began cleaning his windshield with surprising skill. Despite the frost and her tiny hands, she scrubbed carefully, balancing on the curb like it was second nature. When she finished, she returned to his window with a proud smile. "See? Told you I'm good." Brian reached for his wallet and handed her a crisp 20. Her eyes widened. "No, I said 5. That's too much." "It's all right," he said. "Keep it." She shook her head, firm. "I only want 5. This is for helping, not begging." Brian's chest ached. He exchanged the 20 for a 5 and placed it gently in her gloved hand. She beamed. "Thank you, mister." Then she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. As she moved, it slipped from her hand and landed on the windshield. Brian picked it up. The note, written in blue crayon, read, "Please God, send us a miracle." His fingers trembled as he gave it back. She took it carefully and tucked it away without shame. "What's your name?" he asked, voice softer now. "Lily." "What's yours?" "Brian." She nodded thoughtfully. "That's a nice name. My mom says names have meanings. I think yours means quiet heart." Brian said nothing. He was not used to moments like this, simple, unfiltered. The light turned green, cars honked behind him. Lily stepped back onto the sidewalk and waved. Then, leaning toward the window one last time, she whispered, "My mom always says, there's a guardian angel around each of us. I think you might be mine." And with that, she turned and ran, vanishing into the sea of people heading toward the hospital. Brian remained still, even as traffic surged forward. For the first time in years, he did not feel so alone. He felt seen. And somewhere deep inside, a question stirred quietly to life. What if she was right? What if he was someone's miracle? Brian Blake sat in his corner office on the 42nd floor, staring blankly at the Manhattan skyline through the glass wall. The buzz of meetings, ringing phones, and keyboard clicks faded into background noise. For the first time in years, he could not focus. Lily's voice echoed in his mind, clear, sincere, unforgettable. "I think you might be my angel." He leaned back and rubbed his temples. Angels. He had not believed in either since the day his mother died, waiting for a kidney that never came. He was just 8, too young to understand organ donation, but old enough to remember the way she looked at him with tired, loving eyes and whispered, "I'm sorry I can't stay." No miracle, no rescue, just loss. It was the moment Brian stopped trusting the universe and began building a world where he could control everything: money, power, outcome. His success was engineered, his solitude chosen. And yet that morning, a little girl with dirt-smudged cheeks, a $5 offer, and eyes full of hope had unsettled all of it. He picked up the phone and called his assistant. "Andrea," he said, "I need a favor. Quiet." "Of course. There's a little girl, Lily. I met her outside St. Martin's Hospital. She was washing car windows. I want to know who she is, where she lives, why she's out there." Andrea didn't question him. "Give me an hour." Brian ended the call and sat in silence, watching the city pulse below him. He didn't know why Lily got to him. Maybe it was her determination. Or maybe he saw the boy he used to be in her, young, scared, trying to hold the world together with nothing but hope. 45 minutes later, Andrea returned with a file. "Her name is Lily Dawson. She's 5, lives in a low-income housing complex not far from the hospital. Her mother, Nancy Dawson, has been hospitalized for over 2 weeks, stage 5 kidney failure. She's been on a transplant list, but her condition is worsening." Brian opened the file. A photo of Nancy stared back at him, grainy but unmistakably striking. Long blonde hair, pale skin, and the kind of beauty that looked faded, not lost. There was pain in her eyes, but also grace. "She used to illustrate children's books," Andrea continued. "Freelance, mostly. No spouse listed. She's raising Lily alone." Brian sat back, the file still open in his hands. A single mother, no support, dying while her child cleaned windows to raise money. "Thank you," he said quietly. That night, sleep did not come. He lay in his penthouse, listening to the city's distant hum, trying to reason with himself. He had no obligation to help. He had done his part. He had survived, built something out of nothing. But Lily's face wouldn't leave him, and her words, "I think you might be mine." By morning, the decision was made. He called St. Martin's and anonymously paid Nancy's medical bills. Then, ditching his suit and chauffeur, he dressed in jeans, caught a ride share, and walked through the hospital like any ordinary visitor. He told the nurse he was there with a private charity and asked to meet a patient in need. She smiled and led him down a quiet hallway to room 207. The woman in the bed looked thinner than the photo, her cheeks sunken, skin pale against the crisp sheets. A sketch pad rested on her lap, and despite the tremor in her hands, she was drawing a little fox and a girl in a scarf, standing beneath a snowy tree. Brian stood at the doorway, unmoving. His heart thudded against his ribs. He didn't know what came next, he only knew something had shifted, and he could no longer pretend it hadn't. Brian stepped into the hospital room quietly, careful not to disturb the stillness. The woman in the bed did not notice him at first. Her golden hair, dulled by illness but still graceful, hung loosely around her face as she bent over a sketch pad. Her fingers trembled, but they moved with care, sketching something delicate and alive. A butterfly. Even through the unsteadiness of her hand, the lines danced with hope. The wings, stretched wide, seemed ready to lift off the page, fragile but free. Brian stood silently for a moment, watching her. Then he cleared his throat. Nancy looked up, startled. Her eyes, pale green and full of fatigue, met his. "I'm sorry," she said, trying to sit up straighter. "I didn't hear anyone come in." "It's all right," Brian replied, stepping further into the room. "I'm Nathan. I volunteer with a program that visits patients who are also artists. I heard you used to illustrate children's books." A small smile touched her lips. "Used to. I still try when my hands cooperate." "I saw your butterfly," he said, nodding at her pad. "It's beautiful." She laughed, the sound soft but real. "You've only seen half a wing. Even half is enough to feel the life in it." Nancy looked down at the sketch, then back at him. "Drawing helps me feel like I'm somewhere else. Not here, not sick. Just in the story." Brian nodded. "I know that feeling." There was a pause, filled with quiet understanding. she set the sketchpad aside. "Nathan, right?" He nodded again. "I appreciate the visit, but if you're here to offer help, I don't take handouts. I've had offers, and they come from a good place, but I'd rather earn what I can. I still have something left to give." Brian watched her, moved by her quiet strength. "I'm not here to give anything, maybe just to listen. Or maybe buy a drawing if you're selling." Nancy tilted her head, eyes narrowing playfully. "You want to buy a sketch from a stranger in a hospital bed?" "I want something real for my office," Brian replied. "I'm around a lot of polished things. Your work, it feels honest. It slows things down." She studied him again, her gaze gentle but discerning. Then she smiled. "You're a strange one, Nathan. But I like strange." What followed surprised them both. A deep, natural conversation that stretched for over an hour. Nancy spoke about Lily, her voice soft but filled with pride. She described her daughter as wise beyond her years, a girl who noticed everything and believed in invisible things. "She told me last week," Nancy said with a smile, "that a guardian angel was coming. I thought she meant a nurse or a kind neighbor, but Lily said, no, someone you won't expect, but I'll know him when I see him." Brian's heart stilled. He remembered Lily's voice from that morning. "I think you might be mine." Nancy reached for a worn leather folder beside her. "If you really want something for your office, I have a few pieces here. I was going to post them online, but I haven't had the energy." She opened the folder and flipped through page after page. Enchanted forests, starry skies, children chasing fireflies. All of it drawn with whimsical precision, dreamlike and full of longing. Then Brian saw it. A sketch of a little girl, Lily, in a winter coat and knit hat, standing on a city corner. She was holding the hand of a tall man in a business suit. His face was turned, but the posture, the silver watch, the way his shoulders curved protectively toward her. It was him. Brian froze. "This," he said, pointing. Nancy looked. "Lily described that one. Said she saw it in a dream. Said the man who helps us would look like that. Black coat, silver watch, and eyes that were sad but kind." Brian swallowed. He was wearing that coat, that watch, today. He gently closed the folder. "May I keep this one?" Nancy hesitated, then smiled. "I think it was always meant for you." Brian stood, heart pounding. As he reached the door, he paused and looked back. "She's right, you know." Nancy tilted her head. "Who?" "Your daughter. About the world being full of magic." And then he stepped out, the sketch pressed to his chest like something fragile and sacred. Brian returned to the hospital the very next day, and then the day after that. At first, he told himself it was out of responsibility, a sense of moral obligation. He had started something, and it would be wrong to walk away. But deep down, he knew better. It was not obligation that kept drawing him back to the modest hospital room on the second floor. It was Nancy. Every time he stepped inside, something in him softened. The sterile, clinical hallways of St. Martin's felt strangely warmer when he passed through them on the way to her room. He brought coffee, sometimes soup, sometimes art supplies. And each time, he would find Nancy sitting up with her sketch pad, her smile gentle and tired, but genuine. They talked for hours. Nancy spoke in the slow, thoughtful way of someone who had learned to savor moments. She told stories about Lily's questions, the pictures she used to draw for books, the world she dreamed of showing her daughter if she ever got better. She never pitied herself, never asked for help. She simply shared. And for the first time in years, Brian felt heard. Not as a CEO, not as a billionaire, but as a man, just a man. He told her things he had never told anyone, about his mother's death when he was 8, about the way the doctor's eyes couldn't meet his father's when they said she was gone, about the anger that came after, the rage at God, at systems, at everything for being so unfair. He spoke about the emptiness that had chased him into adulthood, the one he tried to bury under boardrooms, investments, and penthouse views. Nancy listened quietly, her hands resting in her lap, her eyes never flinching away. She never said, "I'm sorry," or "That's awful." Instead, she simply said, "That must have been so lonely." And Brian nodded, feeling something unclench in his chest. He found himself laughing more in her presence, real laughter, not the polite chuckles reserved for business dinners or media events. Nancy had a dry sense of humor, a quiet wit that slipped in between their conversations like sunlight through curtains. She teased him about his lack of artistic talent, called him a child trapped in a grown-up's expensive suit, and he loved it. Nancy never asked what he did for a living. She just accepted him, Nathan, the man who liked fairy tales and soup and bought her daughter new sketchbooks. Brian, in turn, started to change, without even noticing it at first. He canceled meetings to spend longer at the hospital. He stopped checking his phone every 5 minutes. He started reading the children's books Nancy had illustrated before her illness. He found himself drawn to their quiet wonder, their sense of hope. He even started smiling at strangers. One day, he brought Nancy a surprise, a contract from a small but reputable publishing house. He had spoken with an editor, arranged everything quietly. The publisher had seen Nancy's old portfolio online and agreed to offer her a freelance deal. She could work from her hospital bed, sketch at her own pace, and earn money doing what she loved. Nancy stared at the contract for a long time, then looked up at him, eyes shining. "How did you—" "I have connections," Brian said with a grin. "Nathan has friends in strange places." Nancy laughed, wiping her eyes. "I haven't felt this useful in a long time." "You've always been useful," Brian said softly. "You just forgot." That night, after leaving the hospital, Brian lingered outside longer than usual. The December wind swept down the empty street, rustling the bare branches of the trees lining the sidewalk. Across the hospital's second-floor window, he could see the soft golden glow of a reading lamp. Through it he saw Nancy, her head resting against the pillow, sketchpad on her lap, fast asleep. Brian stood still. For the first time in his adult life, he did not feel like running toward the next thing. He felt full, alive, and it scared him. He leaned against a streetlight, hands deep in his coat pockets, and looked up at the stars, rare and faint above the city glare. Then he looked back at her window, that single square of light in a dark world, and whispered to himself, "How is it that someone who's dying can make me feel more alive than I've ever been?" The air inside St. Martin's was thick with something heavier than winter. Brian felt it the moment he stepped into Nancy's room that morning. She looked paler, her breath slower, her voice barely a whisper. Even her hands, once so steady with a pencil, now trembled too much to draw. A few hours later, the doctor pulled Brian aside. Her tone was careful, clinical, but even she could not hide the urgency beneath her words. "Nancy's kidneys are shutting down. We're entering critical stages. If she doesn't receive a transplant within the next 30 days, she may not survive." Brian stood silent, hands clenched in his pockets. "Is she on the registry?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "She is, but you know how long that can take." "Especially with her blood type." Brian nodded, mind already racing. That evening, without telling anyone, he went to the hospital's lab and quietly requested to be tested as a potential donor. He told them he was a family friend. No names, no attention. 2 days later, the results came back. He was a perfect match. The odds were astronomical. But there it was, clear and undeniable. He sat in his car in the hospital parking lot for almost an hour, the lab report in his lap, hands shaking slightly. A perfect match. It should have been the answer. A miracle, even. But it came with a price. The hospital administrator informed him that they could not proceed with the transplant unless the donor was officially verified, either as a close family member or as someone with a documented relationship and valid ethical reasoning. Brian would have to come forward, reveal who he really was. Not Nathan, not the kind stranger, but Brian Blake, multi-millionaire CEO, a man who had been keeping secrets. The conflict burned in his chest like acid. If he told her the truth, Nancy might feel betrayed. She would know he had been hiding his identity all along. She might think his help was charity, pity even, and he would lose the one thing he had come to cherish most, her trust. The quiet intimacy, the way she looked at him like a person, not a figure. But if he stayed silent, she could die. He could not live with that. That night he sat in her hospital room while she slept, her chest rising and falling in shallow rhythm. Her sketchpad lay on the nightstand, open to a half-finished drawing of Lily, dancing in the snow. Brian picked up a pen and turned to the next page. He wrote slowly, carefully, letting the words come from the deepest part of him. Dear Nancy, my name is not Nathan. My real name is Brian Blake. Maybe you've heard of me. I'm the CEO of Blake Systems. I didn't come to you as a businessman or a billionaire. I came to you because I needed something real, and then I met you. I watched the way you live even while dying, the way you still see beauty, the way you still choose hope. You reminded me what it meant to feel human again. I never meant to lie. I just didn't want the world you live in to change because of who I am. But now I can't stay silent. I got tested. I'm a match. I can give you my kidney. Not because you need saving, but because you saved me first. Let this be the miracle Lily was waiting for. And if, after this, you never want to see me again, I'll understand. But I had to try. Brian. He folded the note gently and slid it between the pages of her sketchbook. The next morning, he stood outside the operating room, dressed in a gown, heart racing beneath the sterile white layers. No cameras, no entourage, just him and his choice. As they wheeled him in, he closed his eyes and whispered into the quiet, "If miracles are real, give her a life worth living. I don't need her to know it was me." The world came back to Nancy in pieces, slow, soft, and blurry. The beeping of machines, the muted murmur of nurses, a steady warmth at her side. She blinked against the hospital lights, her body heavy, her throat dry. Pain lingered in her abdomen, but it was dull, distant, like something happening to someone else. She turned her head and saw Lily curled up on the couch by the window, fast asleep under a hospital blanket, clutching a stuffed rabbit. Then came the voice of her doctor, gentle and calm. "You're awake. That's a good sign." Nancy tried to speak, but her lips barely moved. The doctor smiled kindly. "The transplant went well. You have a long road of recovery ahead, but your body is responding beautifully." Nancy's brows furrowed weakly. Her voice was hoarse when she finally asked, Who was it?" The doctor glanced down at her chart. "Your donor asked to remain anonymous at first, but we had to list them for legal reasons. Brian Blake." The name barely registered at first. Then the doctor added, "CEO of Blake Systems. It appears you knew him by another name, Nathan." Nancy's breath caught in her throat. She stared at the ceiling as the realization washed over her. Tidal and deep, her heart pounded as fragments of conversations came rushing back. His careful deflections, the way he always asked about her and said little about himself. The warmth in his eyes that somehow never matched the humility of his words. Nathan was Brian Blake. Brian Blake had given her his kidney. The doctor left her alone, and for a long time she lay in stunned silence. Then she turned her head and saw her sketchbook resting on the tray beside her bed. With trembling fingers, she opened it. Her breath hitched. There, tucked between the pages, was a letter, folded and signed in the familiar slant of a man who had come to mean more to her than she ever thought possible. She read every word, and by the end she was crying, silently, freely, with no shame. The tears came from something deeper than sorrow. They were tears of disbelief, of wonder, of something that felt dangerously close to love. Moments later, the door creaked open. Lily tiptoed in, her little face serious and radiant. She held something in her hand, a small, worn $5 bill. Nancy looked at her daughter, confused. "Where are you going, sweetheart?" "To see him," Lily whispered. "He's next door. They said I could visit." Before Nancy could stop her, Lily was gone. Brian lay in the recovery room, eyes closed, his breathing slow but steady. Lily climbed up onto the chair beside him and reached out her tiny hand. She placed the $5 bill gently on his palm, closing his fingers around it. "Cho tra chu truok, vi chula pet mau kwachal," she whispered with a grin. "I'm paying you first because you're my miracle." Brian stirred, opening his eyes groggily. He looked at her, confused at first, then smiled weakly. "Hey, little one." Lily squeezed his hand. "My mommy's gonna be okay now. I knew you were the one. I told her. You're our angel." Brian's throat tightened, emotion rising faster than he could stop it. He managed to say, "I just wanted her to have a chance." "She says thank you," Lily said. "And she's coming." Moments later, Nancy entered the room. She looked pale, exhausted, wrapped in layers of blankets, but her eyes were clear, focused, alive. She crossed the space between them slowly, then sat at his bedside. She said nothing at first, just took his hand and held it. He looked up at her, afraid of what he might see, anger, betrayal, distance. But she only smiled through her tears. "You didn't have to be an angel, Brian," she whispered. "You just had to be you." He closed his eyes, and for the first time in his life, felt completely at peace. The weeks that followed the surgery passed in a kind of soft-focused calm. Brian healed faster than the doctors expected. He was strong, healthy, and motivated by something more powerful than painkillers or rest. He was motivated by a future he never imagined wanting. The media, of course, caught wind of what happened. Rumors spread quickly. The reclusive CEO of Blake Systems had undergone major surgery, had quietly left the company, had been seen visiting a small city hospital more than once. News vans camped outside his apartment, requests for interviews piled up in his inbox. But Brian said nothing. He released a brief, formal statement thanking his team and announcing his resignation as CEO, effective immediately. He named his trusted friend and longtime partner as successor, stating only that "it is time for me to live differently now." Then he disappeared. No press conferences, no goodbye tour, just silence. He sold his penthouse and moved into a quiet house in the suburbs, nestled near a park with a swing set and a garden that caught the sunlight just right in the mornings. The home was modest by his former standards, but perfect. Because it was not just his, it was theirs. Nancy's recovery had been slow but steady. Her color returned, her energy grew, and most of all, her spirit flourished. Every day she seemed more alive than the one before. She laughed more. She sang while making breakfast. She and Lily painted murals in the garage and danced in the kitchen. Nancy had once believed she only had months to live. Now she had years, and she was not wasting a moment. Brian watched her with quiet reverence. In the early evenings, she would sit on the back porch with her sketchbook, filling the pages with scenes from the hospital, memories of her childhood, and soft illustrations of the life she was rediscovering. One afternoon, she turned to Brian and said, "I'm writing our story, not just mine, ours." He smiled. "Are you going to make me the villain?" "No," she said, touching his hand. "You're the chapter where everything changed." Lily thrived in her new world. She ran through the backyard barefoot, collected bugs, read stories aloud to her mother, and insisted on calling Brian Dad, even before he was ready to accept that title. "You don't have to say yes now," Lily had told him one night as he tucked her in, "but you will, because families don't need to match, they just need to love." Brian had barely made it out of the room before the tears came. He had never known a love so quiet, so healing. He had spent years believing that success was measured in numbers, in achievements, in awards. Now, success looked like pancakes on Sunday morning, like Lily's asleep with a book on her chest, like Lily's laughter echoing down the hallway. There was no boardroom, no stock market, no headline in the world that could rival this, and in that peace, Brian found himself again. Not the man he had been before, but the man he was always meant to become. Not a CEO, not a savior, just a father, a partner, a man who believed again. 1 year later, snow blanketed the quiet town where the Blake Dawson family now lived. It covered rooftops and lined the sidewalks, making everything look like it had been pulled from the pages of a fairy tale. Inside a cozy bookstore on Main Street, people gathered for the launch of Nancy Dawson's first children's book, A Miracle Named Brian. Once a single mother in a hospital bed, Nancy was now a published author whose story was touching hearts across the country. Her book told of a little girl with big dreams, a tired mother, and the stranger who entered their lives on a winter morning. It spoke of love found in the most unexpected places, and of courage, not magic, creating second chances. The final page showed a little girl holding hands with two parents under a sky full of floating lanterns. There were no words, none were needed. Brian stood quietly at the back, letting Nancy enjoy her moment, but the quiet did not last. "There's a news crew outside," a store clerk whispered. "They want to ask about the Lily's Wish Foundation." Brian nodded. He never enjoyed attention, but this mattered. In just 1 year, Lily's Wish, named after the little girl who had believed so deeply, had helped over 100 patients receive the care they needed. It connected families awaiting transplants with donors, resources, and hope. That afternoon, the foundation hosted its first annual gathering in a nearby town hall. Families shared stories, volunteers were honored, and love filled the room like sunlight through stained glass. Brian stood at the center of it, no longer the distant CEO, but a man with purpose and a family. As he prepared to speak, Lily tugged at his sleeve. Dressed in a blue dress with a tiny silver star, she whispered, "Can I come with you?" He smiled and offered his hand. On stage, Brian looked out over the crowd, then down at the little girl who had changed his world. "I started Lily's Wish because someone once believed in miracles when I didn't," he said. "Because she believed, I found something I didn't know I was missing. Family." Then Lily stepped forward and reached for the microphone. "I gave my dad $5 once because I thought he was a miracle," she said, holding up the now laminated bill. "But I was wrong." She wrapped her arms around him, her voice soft but clear. "He's not a miracle, he's just everything I ever wished for." The applause swelled, but Brian could only see her. He knelt and held her close. "You're the reason I believe again," he whispered. That night, under a star-lit Christmas Eve sky, the three of them stood by the lake behind their home. Nancy carried a basket of paper lanterns. Brian lit each one. Lily danced barefoot in the snow, writing wishes in the air. One by one, they released the lanterns, watching as they drifted upward, gold and weightless, carrying their hopes into the heavens. Hand in hand, the little family stood still and whispered together. "We asked for a miracle, but love turned out to be the most miraculous thing of all." And in that glow, wrapped in snow and silence, they found their forever home. If this story touched your heart the way it touched ours, please take a moment to reflect on the quiet miracles that surround us every day, the small acts of kindness, the unexpected connections, the love that shows up in the most unlikely places. Because sometimes, the miracle we're waiting for is simply someone who chooses to stay. If you believe in stories that heal, inspire, and remind us of what truly matters, then you're in the right place. Subscribe to Soul-Stirring Stories for more heartfelt tales just like this, true stories of resilience, compassion, and love that change lives. Thank you for watching. And remember, even the smallest light can guide us home.